Olive York Way is located in West Brunswick, Melbourne. It's a small street that runs off Albion Street. The area used to be part of a large industrial estate. Coincidentally, in the late 1970s, for a couple of months, I once worked in one of the factories. Little did I know that decades later, my mother would be honoured by having a street named in her memory. Olive died in 2003 at the age of 87, and in this presentation I'll give you some of her life story and the reasons as to why the Moreland City Council decided to bestow such an honour upon my mother. Olive was born in London in 1916 as Olive Turner. She became Olive York in 1947 on marrying my father, Loreto John York. She adored her father, William, or Will, but when he died in 1926, she was only 10, and I believe she never really recovered from this great loss. Decades later, she would always remember his date of passing and shed a few tears. The loss of her father to tuberculosis had a devastating effect on the family. Her mother Daisy, brother Gus, and sister Vida, who resided in a row of cottages in Iverson Road, West Hampstead, built for railway workers in the late 19th century. Olive did very well at school, but on the passing of her father, the family couldn't afford to keep her at school, so at the age of 14 she left school to begin her trade, which was in the dark room of a photographic studio in London. Olive maintained this trade until 1971, when she retired from Astra Photographic Bridal Studios in Sydney Road, Coburg. I have no doubt at all that my mum and my dad would have excelled at university had they been given the opportunity. Will's death occurred on the eve of the Great Depression. The Depression and, of course, World War II brought great hardship to the people of England, including Daisy and her children. Daisy worked as a domestic servant for rich people who lived in Hampstead. During the war, West Hampstead was among the areas hit by German bombing. Neighbours in a nearby street were killed during one such blitz. Olive still went to work each day, but also served as a fire spotter, going among the rubble with a hand-operated prime pump to extinguish any small fires. Like so many English people, Olive was a cat lover, and cats helped her through the hard times. She named one of her cats NARPAC, an acronym for the National Air Raid Precautions Animals Committee, set up by the British government in 1939. After the war, my mother met and married my father, Loreto York, who was an airman. He was with the Royal Air Force, though he never flew. He served around the Middle East, Africa, Palestine and France before being stationed in London. My parents married in London in 1947. Loreto was Maltese. Originally his name was Loreto Malak, but he changed it to York in 1947. My mum always said that she was attracted to his Mediterranean charm, but unfortunately one of her relatives wasn't impressed and expressed disappointment that Olive was marrying a black man. Such were the times. Sadly, the marriage was not a happy one, though it lasted until 1990, when my parents divorced. As my mum used to say, they did have some happy times though. I was born in May 1951 in London. My mum's pride and joy, the only child. In 1952, London was hit by a terrible smog. It killed 14,000 people in one weekend, mostly elderly and babies. When my dad heard me coughing in my cot with bronchitis, he decided on the spot that we should migrate to Melbourne, where his brother, Joe Malak, had migrated in 1925 from Malta and had been working on the waterfront. However, Olive didn't want to migrate, as she didn't want to leave her mother. In May 1952, Daisy Turner, my grandmother, died, and my mum, Olive, reluctantly agreed to join the scores of thousands of other 10-pound POMs or assisted migrants and migrate to Melbourne, Australia. The voyage took 6 weeks, from London, Tilbury Docks to Melbourne, Station Pier, in 1954. We travelled on the Himalaya. Life can be so unpredictable. Olive had told her friends and family in London that she would be back in 2 years' time, would never settle permanently in Australia. My dad was the one who was keen to go to Melbourne. From day one, my mum said she fell in love with Australia. She loved the open spaces, the freedom, the casual friendliness of the people, and above all, not having to call her boss Mr. My father, ironically, he couldn't stand it here. He was expecting a mini London. Instead, what he found in Melbourne in the 1950s he regarded as very backward, as he used to put it. Life wasn't easy in the first couple of years. We had 7 different lodgings, mostly boarding houses in Coburg and in Brunswick. In these houses you had one family to each room, and there were sometimes unpleasant situations. Still, there was a lot of work. It was easy to get a job back then. My dad worked in factories, and my mum found a job at Astra Bridal Photographic Studios in Sydney Road, Coburg. In 1956, after 2 years going from boarding house to boarding house, we achieved every migrant's dream. We put a deposit on our first home at number 87 Shamrock Street, West Brunswick. Later, in the 1960s, we sold number 87 and moved 2 doors up to a smaller but newer brick veneer house, number 83A, next to a factory in Shamrock Street. Olive was there until 1994. Olive continued to work during the day, while also after work she would do the child rearing, the cooking, the cleaning and other housework. This was quite a typical situation back then. My dad was a strong trade unionist, a socialist, and he was shop steward in the factories where he worked. He joined the Brunswick branch of the Labor Party in the 1960s, and he was elected to the Brunswick City Council. My mother wasn't a political person, but she did support the Women's Lib movement. She always said that she wished she'd been born later in life so she could have more fully enjoyed the achievements of Women's Lib. In 1972, my father, Loreto, became Mayor of Brunswick, a first for the Maltese in Australia and the first ethnic, in inverted commas, mayor of that very multicultural city. Olive was his mayoress in 1972 to 73 when he was first mayor, and again in 1976-77. The mayor didn't receive a wage, so Dad kept working in the factory, but Olive had retired in 1971 after 40 years in fume-filled photographic darkrooms in London and Melbourne. Olive was a meticulous person, and the detailed handwritten notes that she left behind indicate that in one 10-month period in 1977, my dad and her attended 209 official functions. That has to be a record. Olive was quite a nervous person, but she could use her nervous energy in positive ways. In the late 1970s, in her early 60s, she enrolled at Brunswick Technical School to learn Pitman's shorthand. She was the oldest in the class, but she did very well. She used her new skill to take on a hobby job with the local newspaper, the Brunswick Sentinel, reporting on local community events and people. She was typically diligent and conscientious in this work, and her weekly reports over 10 years from 1976 are today invaluable sources for historians with an interest in the grassroots people's history. She gave up this work at the age of 75. She was paid a pittance. It was a hobby job, a labour of love for the community, and the costs of transport to the different functions meant she was always in the red. It was becoming tiring for her as well. And she was disappointed when people would complain about trivial things, and rarely was she thanked for the great work she was doing for the community. She probably reported on about 2,000 community events in those 10 years, everything from ethnic and sporting clubs to women's groups, the Returned Services League and council events, and many others. In 1985, my mother and I made a trip to London. It was her second visit back home. The first was in 1971. We had a great week together, the highlight being visiting her brother, my Uncle Gus, and her sister Vida. Vida still lived in the workers' cottage in West Hampstead. The family never owned it. We always rented it. First from the Midland Railway Company in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and then it was purchased by the large factory that was behind the row of cottages in Iverson Road. I remember as we left London on the flight in 1985, my mum shed a few tears. She rightly sensed that this would be the last time she would see her brother and sister and the city in which she was born and raised. I took quite a few photos, and this is one of my favourites. It shows the three Turner children, Olive, Gus and Vida, together in 1985. In 1990, my parents divorced. Dad moved to Canberra, where I had settled in the late 1980s, and my wife and I were able to assist in his resettlement. Olive remained on her own in the house in Brunswick, but she found it difficult in her advancing years. The birth of her first grandchild in Canberra prompted her to decide to sell the Shamrock Street house and to move to Canberra. It was not smooth sailing by any means, but she did love being a grandmother. As I said previously, life is unpredictable. My divorced parents ended up in the same block of units in Canberra, but at opposite ends of the block. They communicated regularly, and they both agreed they had never got on so well. As the new century was about to break, my mother was diagnosed with a brain tumour. She underwent an 8-hour operation which was only partially successful. Her spirit, her desire to keep on enjoying life, was indomitable. Her surgeon called her a legend just because she survived such an operation at the age of 84. Then another blow came with a diagnosis of bowel cancer. That she survived the second major surgery of similar length is just incredible. She did her best to remain positive and cheery throughout all this, and she spoke often of her English spirit, which had been forged through adversity. She survived for a couple more years, but then succumbed in October 2003. Her body was too weak and the cancer too strong. At the memorial service, I repeated what I had often told her when I was a child, a teenager, and an adult. She was the best mum in the world.